I want you to picture something with me before I tell you how we got there. Picture a woman standing in a room. Her son's living room, actually. A nice room with expensive furniture she didn't pick out. Holding a manila folder thick enough to choke on. Picture her hands not shaking. That's the important part. Her hands not shaking. Even though everything she built her life around is decomposing in real time, right there between the leather couch and the gas fireplace he bought with her money. Picture her voice when she finally speaks, coming out level as a surgical cut. No screaming, no crying. Just a woman who has finally finished grieving the person she thought her son was, and has moved cleanly into the territory beyond grief. What comes after grief when you've been robbed by someone who called you mama? It doesn't have a word. It lives in the body like something calcified. You looked at your phone, she says. I say, saw your mother was dying, and typed one word. That word told me everything about who you actually are. That's where we're going. That's the moment I need you to hold on to while I take you back to where it started. It started at the kitchen sink. Specifically, it started on a Tuesday morning in January, in my small cottage with peeling paint and a vegetable garden that had been sleeping under frost since November. Oak Park, Chicago. A waterfront neighborhood where fishing boats sit locked in the frozen harbor all winter long, and seagulls wheel overhead crying into the gray morning like they're mourning something they can't name. I have lived in this neighborhood for 19 years. I know every creak of this house, every draft that sneaks under the back door, every particular sound the radiator makes at 4:00 a.m. when it decides to remind me that I am not alone. This cottage is mine. I want you to remember that. I was standing at the sink watching the sun come up through the window. I do that every morning. It's a ritual I didn't consciously choose. It just became part of who I am. The black-eyed peas were already cooking with a ham hock on the back burner, because I'd started them at 5 in the morning. That's what I do in winter, when the cold keeps me inside and the windows fog up from the warmth, when the harbor goes quiet and the cottage fills up with smells, the ham hock, the coffee, the particular sweetness of food that has been cooking slowly and without impatience. I was wearing my cherry red housecoat. Every morning I put it on before anything else, because it is the one thing in this house that belongs entirely to me and no one else. My cross necklace, the one I've worn since my baptism, the one my mother clasped around my neck with hands that smelled like Jergens lotion, was warm against my collarbone. On the counter, my handwritten recipe cards stained with years of cooking were spread out where I'd left them the night before, trying to finish the last few quilt squares for my youngest grandchild's blanket. I quilt a blanket for each grandchild. That's who I am. The woman who stitches love into fabric because she ran out of other ways to say it. And then the pressure started. Not dramatic. Not like the movies, where the man clutches his arm and crashes through a glass table. Just a slow, crushing weight behind my sternum, like someone had stacked river stones on top of my heart while I wasn't looking. I stood at the sink for a moment and breathed. Told myself it was gas. Told myself it was stress. Put my hand on the counter to steady myself and felt the rim of my recipe cards beneath my palm and thought, absurdly, I need to finish that quilt. I picked up my phone with my right hand. The weight in my chest was spreading now, moving into my jaw. I typed 4 words to my son Marcus. I'm at the hospital. I want you to understand what it took to type those words. I want you to understand that I am a woman who spent 26 years as a licensed practical nurse, who has watched people fight for their lives in rooms that smelled like antiseptic and fear, and that asking for help, even from my own child, felt like defeat. I typed those 4 words and I meant them as a lifeline. I meant them as a mother reaching across the cold January air of Oak Park and saying, I need you. See me. Come. He replied in 11 minutes. Busy. 1 word. 4 letters. Delivered without punctuation, without a question mark, without a follow-up. I stood there holding my phone in one hand and my cross necklace in the other, and I felt something leave my body. Not my soul. I don't want to be dramatic. Something more specific than that. Whatever illusion I had been protecting for the last several years, the one that told me my son loved me the way I loved him, departed. Quietly and without ceremony, like a bird that finally gives up on a window and flies away. And then the neighbors found me on the kitchen floor 40 minutes later, and the paramedics came, and the doctors confirmed what the Riverstones had been trying to tell me all morning. But even in the ambulance, even with the oxygen mask and the EKG leads, even then, I was thinking about those recipe cards on the counter. Who was going to put them away? Who was going to turn off the black-eyed peas? I was thinking, that cottage is mine. I need to get back to it. I didn't know yet that it almost wasn't. If someone in your life is going through something like this, isolated, dismissed, their cries for help met with silence, please share this story with them. Sometimes knowing someone else survived is the first thing that makes survival feel possible. Now let me tell you the rest of what happened. Let me tell you who I was before I let them convince me I was nobody. I was a licensed practical nurse for 26 years in the Cook County Hospital system. I read charts. I questioned dosages. I once argued with a senior physician for 45 minutes because his medication order was wrong, and I knew it was wrong, and I wasn't going to let a man's credentials intimidate me into silence when there was a patient in that bed who needed me to be right. I was right. The physician acknowledged it the next morning and didn't look me in the eye for a week. I didn't care. That's who I was. I was also a mother who made every mistake that love can make when it has no boundaries. Marcus was my firstborn. And when you carry a person inside your body and then spend the next 18 years building yourself around their needs, something complicated happens to your sense of self. You don't notice it at first. You notice it decades later. When you're standing in your kitchen in Oak Park trying to remember the last decision you made purely for yourself, and the answer that comes back is a silence so long it has its own weight. I had a hobby before the troubles began. I've quilted since Marcus was in diapers. Not just the grandchildren's blankets, but full quilts, intricate patterns, wedding ring and double Irish chain and log cabin, sold at the church bazaar every fall for $35 apiece. People came looking for my quilts specifically. But somewhere around 2016, when Marcus started calling me twice a day with problems, I put the quilting frame in the back bedroom and stopped taking it out. There was always something more urgent. His car note, his rent, his business idea that needed a little seed money. The quilts stopped, and I didn't even mourn them because I was too busy being needed. That's what love does when it goes wrong. It makes need feel like intimacy. The black-eyed peas with the ham hock. That recipe is my mother's, and her mother's before that. Every winter Sunday I made a pot, and when the children were small, they'd sit on the kitchen counter and watch me skim the foam and adjust the salt and talk about their weeks. Those Sunday dinners were when I felt most like myself. The woman in the kitchen, yes, but on her own terms, queen of her own small domain. By 2020, Marcus had stopped coming to Sunday dinners entirely. Too busy. Got plans. Maybe next week. And I told myself that was fine. Children grow up. I told myself that was healthy. I told myself a lot of things that year that I should have let myself grieve instead. Every morning before I get out of bed, I touch my cross necklace. It's become so automatic I don't always notice I'm doing it. Just my fingers finding the weight of it in the dark, the familiar smooth metal, the promise it makes. My faith has always been the thing that kept me upright when everything else was tilting. I am not a perfect Christian. I don't have all the answers about why God allows suffering, but I believe, bone deep, that I was put here to be useful, and that my usefulness is not the same as my value. That distinction, it turned out, was going to matter enormously. The first inconsistency appeared in the fall of 2021. I was looking at my bank statements. I still did that then, hadn't yet handed the habit over to Marcus completely, and I noticed a withdrawal I didn't recognize. $400, transferred to an LLC with a name that meant nothing to me. I called Marcus. He laughed. A light, easy laugh, the kind designed to make the person asking the question feel silly for asking. Mom, that's the management account. We talked about this, remember? When you had your hip surgery and you set up the automatic transfers. I did not remember. But I had also, during the hip surgery recovery, been taking pain medication that fogged my memory for weeks. So I said, I don't remember that. And he said, gently, with a patience that now turns my stomach. Mom, you were on a lot of meds. It's okay. I set it all up so you wouldn't have to worry about it. That's what I'm here for. I want you to understand, and I need you to sit with this, because if you have never been gaslit by someone you love, you may not understand how completely it works. I believed him. Not because I was stupid, not because I was old and confused, though he certainly wanted me to think that was the reason. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative, that my son was lying to me with the ease of a man who had been lying to me for years, was something I wasn't built to accept. I assume I caused the mistreatment. That was my belief. Every time something was wrong, I found a way to fold it back on myself. I was too suspicious. I was ungrateful. I hadn't been clear enough about my expectations. A good mother trusted her son. A good Christian woman didn't let the devil whisper accusations into her ear about her own flesh and blood. I had given Marcus everything I had to give. I want you to understand the scope of that sacrifice because it matters to what came next. When I was 26 years old, I had a plan for my life that had nothing to do with self-erasure. I was going to make enough money nursing to put a down payment on a property of my own eventually. Maybe even a small apartment by the ocean I'd always dreamed about, somewhere far from Chicago winters, where the sound of waves would replace the sound of ice. Instead, I spent 3 decades redirecting every dollar of fortune and savings I accumulated toward the people around me. His car, his rent, his bail. Yes, I posted his bail once, in 2013, and I told exactly no one about that because the shame of it sat in me like a swallowed stone. Over 23 years, I gave Marcus $214,000. I know the exact number because eventually I counted. And the counting was the thing that broke something open in me that could never be fully closed again. But that reckoning hadn't come yet. In the fall of 2021, I hung up the phone and went back to my kitchen and skimmed the foam off the black-eyed peas and told myself everything was fine. I stood at the sink and watched a seagull land on the frozen harbor and thought, you raised a good man. He's taking care of you. That's what family does. I didn't see the second withdrawal until February. There is a particular kind of stillness that comes when you finally stop crying and start thinking. It doesn't feel like strength. Not at first. It feels like something has gone numb, like frostbite of the soul. You can't feel the thing anymore, so at least it stopped hurting. But underneath the numbness, if you're paying attention, you can feel something else beginning. Something cold and precise and patient. I know now what that feeling is. It's the nurse coming back, the nurse who read every chart, who questioned every dosage, who didn't let credentials or relationships or the warm, easy weight of someone's explanation stop her from finding the actual truth. She'd been gone a long time. She came back on a Tuesday morning in November, when Marcus left his phone on my kitchen table. He had come by for Thanksgiving week prep, or that's what he said, though in retrospect, I think he came to check on me, to make sure I was still compliant, still confused, still the version of his mother he needed me to be. He ate some of the leftover black-eyed peas straight from the pot with a spoon, the way he'd done since he was 7 years old, and he got a call and walked out to the back garden to take it. and he left his phone face up on the table, unlocked. I wasn't trying to look. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't snooping. I was standing at the counter with my recipe card spread out in front of me, looking at my mother's handwriting on the one for sweet potato pie, and the message just appeared on his screen while I was looking in that direction. The phone lit up. The preview showed the first line, and the first line was enough. The final deed transfer for the Oak Park property cleared this morning. Your mother's cottage is now fully in the LLC's name. I read it 4 times. My handwritten recipe cards stained with years of cooking were right there under my hands, and I gripped the edge of the counter and I read that message 4 times, and the world went very quiet in the particular way that the world goes quiet right before something enormous happens. Marcus came back inside 3 minutes later. He picked up his phone. He didn't look at the screen. He said the call had been boring and asked if I had any hot sauce. I said I didn't have any hot sauce. He said he'd bring some next time. He kissed me on the forehead and he left, and I stood in my kitchen for 17 minutes without moving. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and I did the math. This was the collapse, not a dramatic breakdown, not the kind of grief that makes noise and draws witnesses. Just a woman at a kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a calculator and a bank folder she'd been meaning to organize for 6 months, and the particular, devastating arithmetic of finally counting what she gave versus what she received. 214 euro dollars given over 23 years. Birthday money, emergency loans, rent, tuition, bail. Income from my nursing career redirected to keep him afloat through crisis after crisis. My retirement fund, dipped into twice because he said it was urgent and I believed him. My net worth, which had been building slowly and stubbornly through decades of double shifts and careful saving, methodically emptied into a drain that wore my son's face. What had I received? A busy text when my heart was failing. That would come later, but even then, sitting at the table in November, I already knew the shape of the answer. I pressed my handwritten recipe cards to my chest, my mother's handwriting, her stained thumbprints on the corner of the black-eyed peas card, her careful cursive that I had been trying to protect from kitchen damage for 30 years, and I cried until I couldn't see the legal pad anymore. I want you to understand something. I am not a woman who cries easily. 26 years in hospital rooms will do that to a person. You learn to hold the grief while the patient is watching and let it go somewhere private later. But this crying was different. This wasn't grief. This was the sensation of a structure that you built your entire identity around finally, visibly collapsing, and you are standing inside it, and you have to decide in real time whether you're going to be buried in it or walk out. I cried for an hour. Then I stopped. I wiped my face on my cherry red housecoat. I touched my cross necklace, and I opened his phone. I still had the passcode from years ago when he'd asked me to check his messages while he was driving. And I started reading. What I found was worse than what I'd already imagined. Forged signatures on documents I had never seen. Fake contracts that had transferred $147,000 from my savings account into an LLC I hadn't created, though my name was on it. The deed transfer, the one the attorney had mentioned in that message, had been in process for 14 months. There were emails between Marcus and someone I didn't recognize. A name I would later learn belonged to a real estate attorney in Evanston, who had been processing the transfer of my cottage, the cottage I had held together with prayer and stubbornness for 19 years, into an LLC that Marcus controlled entirely. My cottage, my peeling paint and vegetable garden and fogged-up windows and black-eyed peas. My home. I photographed every document on his phone that I could find. My hands were completely steady. That's the part I need you to understand. After the hour of crying, my hands were steady as a surgical tray, because the woman who had cried was a mother, and the woman who was photographing was a nurse, and the nurse had work to do. The recipe cards were still on the table when I finished. My mother's handwriting. Years of stained thumbprints. I thought, this is what they can't take. They can try to take my house, my savings, my income, my identity, but they cannot take the handwriting of a woman who loved me before I knew what love was. That thought was the first solid thing I'd stood on in hours. The photographs on my phone were not enough. I knew that before I went to bed that night. I had spent 26 years in hospitals, which means I spent 26 years in rooms where evidence mattered, where documentation was the difference between an outcome and a disaster. And I understood instinctively that what I had, blurry phone screenshots of another person's unlocked screen, would not hold up to scrutiny. I needed originals. I needed a paper trail. I needed, if I was being honest with myself, help from someone who understood the legal architecture of what Marcus had built. But before any of that, I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. Her name was Sister Dolores. She wasn't my pastor. She led the grief circle at Second Baptist, the one I'd started attending after my second hip surgery when the loneliness of recovery had become something I could no longer manage alone. Sister Dolores was in her early 70s, with a voice like gravel and honey, and the particular patience of a woman who has sat with more suffering than most people ever witness. She showed up at my hospital room 2 days after the heart attack, while I was still in the cardiac care unit, with a mason jar of her homemade vegetable soup wrapped in a dish towel, and a silence that somehow communicated everything I needed to hear before she'd said a word. She pulled a chair up to my bed. She set the soup on the tray table. She took both of my hands in hers, and she looked at me with eyes that had no judgment in them, none, and she said, "Tell me what happened. Start wherever you need to start." I told her everything: the deed transfer message, the photographs, the legal pad calculations, the 214s, DWARDs, the busy text, all of it. I talked for a long time, and Sister Dolores held my hands and said almost nothing. And at the end of it, she was quiet for a moment, looking down at our joined hands, and then she said, "Beloved, being deceived is not the same as being foolish. Evil doesn't come in ugly packages." I want you to understand what those words did to me. For years, I had been explaining away the evidence of my own mistreatment by telling myself that I was the problem, that I was confused, suspicious, ungrateful, faithless, that a good mother wouldn't think this way. Sister Dolores looked at me and told me that none of that was true, that I had been deliberately targeted by someone who knew exactly how to exploit the love I had for him, that the sophistication of the deception was evidence of his planning, not of my stupidity. I cried again, there in the cardiac care unit, and this time it felt different. This time it felt like something releasing rather than something breaking. Sister Dolores was quiet for a moment after I'd finished crying. Then she said carefully, "There are others, aren't there?" I didn't know what she meant at first. Then, slowly, I began to understand what she was asking. Marcus had a pattern. Sister Dolores had seen it. The way wise elders see patterns in the behavior of people they've watched grow up. The way someone with 70 years of observation can recognize a character flaw operating across multiple relationships. She knew about his Aunt Patricia. She knew, because Patricia had spoken to her privately at a church event the previous spring, that Patricia had also been asked to sign documents she hadn't fully understood, that money she had lent Marcus had never been returned, that she had begun to feel uneasy, but hadn't known what to do with the unease. She suggested I call Patricia. I called Patricia from the hospital room that evening. The conversation lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, we had agreed to call Marcus's cousin Renee, who had her own story, and Renee led us to Dana, Marcus's ex-wife, who had the most complete picture of all, because she had been watching him operate from the inside for 4 years before she finally left. When Dana told me what she knew, I felt the rage move through me like cold water through a pipe. Clean and cold and absolutely purposeful. No more confusion, no more self-blame. Just the pure, clarifying anger of a woman who has finally understood that the fog she has been living in was manufactured, that someone chose to build it around her, that the disorientation she had been interpreting as her own failing was actually a tool being used against her. The sadness that had been sitting in me since November, since the kitchen table and the legal pad and the hour of crying, shifted. I don't want to say it left, because it didn't leave entirely. But it moved to the back. And what came forward was something colder and more useful. I began to think strategically. I called the four of us together, myself, Patricia, Renee, and Dana, at Sister Dolores's kitchen table on a Saturday in December. We brought everything: bank statements, emails, photographs, dates, amounts. Dana had saved text messages. Patricia had a copy of a contract she'd signed without reading, and had only recently, in the wake of our conversation, taken to a lawyer friend to examine. The lawyer friend had looked at it and told her the signature on the bottom was not hers. We laid everything out on Sister Dolores's table, and for the first time, we saw the full architecture of what Marcus had built: the web of forged signatures, fake contracts, small extractions that individually looked like family generosity and collectively added up to something that had a legal name: financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. I touched my cross necklace and looked at the documents spread across Sister Dolores's table and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, though the anger was there. Not grief, though that was there too. Something firmer than either. Something like the woman who had argued with a physician for 45 minutes and been right. I was back. The hardest performance of my life had nothing to do with what I said. It had to do with what I didn't say, and for how long, and with what expression on my face while I was saying nothing. Between that Saturday at Sister Dolores's table and the confrontation I was building toward, there were 6 weeks in which I had to interact with Marcus while giving no indication that anything had changed. He called twice a week, same as always. He stopped by the cottage on the second Sunday of December with a poinsettia in a plastic pot and the ease of a man who does not believe he can be caught. He sat at my kitchen table and ate the Christmas cookies I'd made and talked about his business plans. And I nodded and smiled and poured more coffee and watched him the way you watch a person when you finally understand what they are. I want you to know that I was quilting the whole time. I had taken the quilting frame back out of the back bedroom in November, the night after I'd photographed the documents on his phone. I don't know exactly why. Some instinct that I needed to be doing something with my hands that belonged entirely to me. Something that Marcus had no part of and no claim to. The pattern I chose was double Irish chain, which is more complex than it looks, all interlocking squares that have to align precisely, or the whole design collapses. I worked on it during the 6 weeks of waiting, in the mornings before the sun came up, and in the evenings after Marcus had stopped by or called, and I had successfully pretended to be the woman he thought he was managing. The performance took everything I had. I am not built for deception, even necessary deception, even the kind that is fundamentally an act of self-protection. Every conversation with Marcus felt like walking across ice. Too much weight in any one spot, and the whole surface cracks. I chose my words the way I used to choose them in hospital rooms when the news was bad, and I needed a patient to stay calm. Carefully, one at a time. Nothing that revealed the full picture. One afternoon in January, about 3 weeks before the confrontation, he stopped by unexpectedly and found me at the kitchen table with the 47-page file we'd assembled. I had gotten careless. I'd been reviewing the documents and hadn't heard the car pull into the drive. He walked in the way he always walked in, without knocking, and I had approximately 4 seconds to fold the file shut and slide it under the recipe card box before he came through the kitchen doorway. He looked at me. I looked at him. My heart rate was doing something that reminded me, unpleasantly, of January in the cardiac care unit. "What are you doing?" he said. "Going through some old papers," I said. "I've been meaning to organize." He looked at the table for a moment. My recipe cards were on top of the file folder. My mother's handwriting, the stained thumbprints on the sweet potato pie card. He looked at the recipe cards, then back at me, and I held his gaze and smiled the smile of a woman who has absolutely nothing to hide and everything in the world to discuss if he wanted to. A smile I'd been practicing in my bathroom mirror for 3 weeks. He went and got a glass of water from the sink. "You eating okay?" he asked. You look tired." "I'm fine," I said. "Just been sleeping a little light." He left 20 minutes later. I sat in the kitchen until I heard his car pull away, and then I put both hands flat on the table and breathed. Just breathed. My cross necklace was warm against my collarbone. Outside, through the fogged winter window, I could see a seagull sitting on the fence post in the vegetable garden, its head turned sideways, watching the frozen ground. The same week that close call happened, I did the thing I had promised myself I would do. I walked down to the corner market, the one 3 blocks from the cottage, where the owner always recognized me and asked about my grandchildren, and I bought myself a bouquet of tulips. Bright yellow tulips, unreasonable and vivid in the January gray. I paid for them with my own money, the money in the small account Marcus didn't know about, the one I'd opened in my own name at a different bank after the November discovery. I brought the tulips home and put them in the good vase and stood at the kitchen sink and looked at them. It sounds like a small thing. You might be wondering why I'm telling you about flowers. Those tulips were the first thing I had done purely for myself in longer than I could calculate. They were not for Marcus. They were not for my grandchildren, though I love my grandchildren more than breath. They were not for anyone who needed something from me, or wanted something from me, or was going to be better for having received them. They were for me. The woman in the cherry red housecoat. The woman who had been erasing herself for decades in exchange for a love that, it turned out, had a cash value and a bottom. I stood at the sink with those tulips on the counter and touched my cross necklace and thought, this is the beginning. Not the confrontation, not the 47 pages, not the family attorney we were meeting in 9 days. This bright, unreasonable yellow in a gray January kitchen, this is where it actually starts. The file was already with the attorney. Patricia and Renee and Dana had submitted their statements. The deed transfer, we had confirmed, was legally invalid because my wet signature had been required and the notarization had been fabricated, meaning the cottage was still mine. The documentation was in order. Sister Dolores had prayed over every one of us individually and told us we were doing the right thing. Everything was in place. I started the black-eyed peas the night before the confrontation, same as always. Put the ham hock in at 5:00 p.m. and let it go all night on low. When I woke up in the morning, the cottage was full of the smell of my mother's recipe, and the windows were fogged from the warmth, and the harbor outside was still frozen and still. I put on my cherry red housecoat. I touched my cross necklace. I laid the 47-page file on the kitchen table. I called Marcus and told him I needed to talk to him about my will. I said it was urgent. I said it was health-related, left over from the heart attack scare. He came at 11 in the morning. I heard the Lexus LS pull into the drive, champagne gold, bright as a provocation against the winter sky. I watched it through the fogged window and thought, that car was paid for with the income of a woman who stood at this sink every morning at 5:00 a.m. and got the peas started. He just didn't know she knew that yet. I heard his key in the lock. I picked up my coffee cup and turned to face the door. He came in the way he always came in, without knocking, with the comfort of a man who has never had reason to feel unwelcome in this house. He was wearing a good coat, the kind that costs more than my first car, and his shoes were clean, and his expression was the particular expression he wore when he was being a considerate son. Slightly worried, slightly warm. That performance of concern that had taken me 20 years to recognize as a costume. "Mom," he said, "you look better than I expected." "Sit down, Marcus," I said. Something in my voice caught him. I could see it, a flicker of recalibration, the slightest pause before he pulled out the kitchen chair and sat. He looked at the table and saw the file, which I had left face down. He looked at my recipe cards, which were off to one side. He looked at the tulips in the good vase. He looked at me. I want to tell you what I looked like in that moment, because it matters. I was wearing my cherry red housecoat. My cross necklace was outside the collar, visible. I had not done my hair into anything elaborate or dressed in anything designed to communicate power in the way power is usually communicated, by wealth, by formality, by the expensive coat. I was wearing what I wear every morning. I looked exactly like what I am. A 58-year-old woman who has been standing in this kitchen for 19 years and intends to keep standing in it. That, it turned out, was more intimidating than anything else I could have worn. I sat down across from him. I did not open the file yet. "How's business?" I said. He relaxed slightly. The familiar ground. He talked for 3 minutes about the LLC, about some expansion he was planning, about a property in Logan Square he was looking at. While he talked, I watched his mouth. I thought about the 47 pages in that folder. I thought about Dana's text messages and Renee's documents and Patricia's forged signature and the real estate attorney's message on an unlocked phone screen on a Tuesday morning in November. I thought about a cardiac care unit and a mason jar of soup and Sister Dolores's hands around mine. I thought about the word busy. "Marcus," I said when he finished, "I need to ask you something. And I need you to be honest with me. Can you be honest with me?" "Of course, Mom," he said. The patient voice, the easy voice. "The Oak Park property," I said. "Tell me about the LLC." The recalibration was faster this time and more visible. Something moved behind his eyes. A rapid calculation, the kind I recognized from hospital rooms when a patient was deciding how much to tell the doctor. "We talked about this," he said. "When you were recovering from the hip surgery." "No," I said. "We didn't." He leaned forward. The patience in his voice acquired an edge. "Mom, you were on medication. You forget things. I'm going to stop you there," I said. I opened the file. "I want you to picture this. A kitchen table in a small cottage in Oak Park, Chicago, in January, with winter pressing against the windows and the smell of black-eyed peas faint in the air from the previous night, and a bouquet of yellow tulips in the good vase. A woman in a cherry-red housecoat sliding a 47-page document across the table to her son. The son's face. And I watched it with clinical attention. The way I used to watch a patient's face when I delivered a diagnosis, going through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, then calculation. Then, briefly, something that might have been shame, though it disappeared too quickly for me to be certain. "This," I said, "is what we actually talked about." The file contained the forged signatures, compared side by side with my actual signature from documents I'd signed in the presence of witnesses. It contained the account transfers, every dollar from my savings that had moved into the LLC, the business entity that was registered in my name but controlled entirely by him, the deed transfer attempt, the emails with the Evanston attorney, Dana's statements, Renee's documentation, Patricia's forged contract. $147,000 moved without my knowledge. The deed transfer that would have made me homeless in my own cottage. The profit from my net worth, steadily redirected into his business operations over 4 years. He looked at the documents for a long time. "Where did you get these?" he said finally. "From the people you thought weren't paying attention," I said. He tried several approaches. He told me I was misunderstanding the legal structure. I let him finish. He told me that the money had been investments on my behalf and he could explain all the returns. I let him finish. He told me I was hurting him, that this wasn't the kind of relationship we were supposed to have, that he couldn't believe I'd been investigating him. I let him finish. Every explanation evaporated when I pointed to the specific forged document it was supposed to explain. He was building sandcastles in the tide, and the tide was the 47 pages on my kitchen table. "Call your lawyer," I said at the end of it. He stared at me. "I'm not your confused mother on pain medication," I said. "I'm a woman who spent 26 years in hospitals reading documents that had life and death consequences. You built this on the wrong foundation." He pushed back from the table. His face had done something I hadn't seen before, gone tight, with a rigidity that I recognized as the expression of a man who has run out of maneuvers. "I'll get this sorted," he said. "Yes," I said. "You will." He walked out. I heard the champagne gold Lexus back out of the drive. I sat at the table with the 47 pages spread in front of me and my mother's recipe cards beside them and the tulips in the good vase and the winter fogging up the windows. I touched my cross necklace. I said a prayer that was mostly gratitude. Then I picked up the phone and called Sister Dolores. "Here is what I want you to understand about the moment when you finally say the true thing out loud to the person who has been lying to you. It doesn't feel the way you imagined it. You've imagined it feeling like an explosion, like release, like pressure finally finding an exit. But it doesn't feel like that. It feels like surgery, precise, necessary, and completely without drama, because drama would mean you still had something to prove." I had already said most of what needed to be said at the kitchen table, in the private confrontation that I told you about. But the confrontation had a second phase, and the second phase was not private. It happened 8 days later, and Marcus brought it on himself. He showed up at Second Baptist. I want you to picture that. He walked into Sunday service at the church I have attended for 15 years, in the waterfront neighborhood in Oak Park where everyone knows my name and knows my family history, and he sat in the third pew, my pew, and waited for the service to end so he could catch me before I got to my car. His plan, I understood later, was to have a public, emotional reconciliation that would look like a family healing itself. He wanted witnesses to his contrition. He was going to be the good son who had made mistakes and was making them right. And he wanted that performance to happen in front of the people whose opinion of him still mattered. What he didn't know was that the file had already gone to his employer. I need to explain that. In the 7 days between the kitchen confrontation and the Sunday at Second Baptist, our attorney had sent a certified letter to Marcus's firm, a financial services company in the Loop, with a summary of the documented fraud and the specific concern about a licensed financial professional operating in the same manner with other clients. The firm had an obligation to act. They acted. His professional license was under review by the time he walked into that church. He didn't know yet. I could tell by the way he approached me, with the practiced ease of a man who believes he still controls the narrative. I was standing in the vestibule in my church coat, talking to Sister Dolores and Patricia when he came up behind me. "Mom," he said, "can we talk?" I turned around. Here is the thumbnail moment I want you to keep. A 58-year-old woman in a church vestibule in Oak Park, Chicago in January. Winter coat, cross necklace visible at the collar, both hands loose at her sides, completely still. Her son in front of her, handsome and practiced and already constructing the apology speech in real time. Sister Dolores to her left, Patricia to her right, the rest of the congregation flowing around them like water around stones, and the woman's face, not angry, not tearful, absolutely, perfectly still. "You want to talk," I said. "Okay, let's talk." He started with an apology. I let him get 3 sentences in. "You looked at your phone," I said, "saw your mother was dying and typed 1 word. That word told me everything about who you actually are." He tried to interrupt. I continued. "I built you. I know every weakness in this foundation. Don't make me use it." He went quiet. "The letter already went to your firm," I said. "The attorney filed on Wednesday. Patricia and Renee and Dana have all given their statements. You have approximately 72 hours before this becomes something you cannot manage." His face. I watched it go through everything. Disbelief, anger, the calculation, again, the rapid assessment of options. Then something underneath all of those. Something I had never seen on my son's face before. Genuine fear. Not of me. Of consequences. Of a world that was rearranging itself around his actions and not waiting for his permission. "Mom," he said. and his voice had lost the performance. "Mom, please. I want you to hear what I said next, because it is the truest thing I have ever said to another human being. I loved you without conditions for your entire life, and you used that love like a line of credit. You don't get to call me Mom right now. Right now, you need to call your lawyer." I turned back to Sister Dolores. "I want you to understand, and I need you to feel this, that turning away was not coldness. It was not cruelty. It was the most difficult physical act of my life. The act of choosing myself over the instinct to smooth things over, to absorb his distress, to fold his pain into my own body and carry it for him the way I had been carrying things for him for 23 years. Every part of me that was his mother wanted to turn back. Every part of me that had finally, at 58 years old, decided to be a whole person refused. He stood in that vestibule for a moment that lasted longer than any moment I have ever lived through. Then he left. Sister Dolores put her hand on my arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The congregation moved around us. Somewhere in the church, the choir was still singing, and the music came through the vestibule doors in fragments. Something about being held, about being carried, about the particular mercy of a love that does not require you to destroy yourself to prove it. I touched my cross necklace. I thought about a woman standing at her kitchen sink, watching the sun come up, and not knowing that in 5 minutes her chest would begin to close. I thought about what she would say if she could see this moment. I think she would say, "This is what I was building toward. All of it. The nursing years, the quilts, the recipe cards. The 19 winters in this cottage was preparation for the moment I stood in a church vestibule in a winter coat and finally said, 'Enough. Enough.' That word, it turns out, is the most powerful word in the English language when you've spent 23 years believing it was unavailable to you. The justice had already been set in motion, but I didn't know yet just how completely the ground was about to shift beneath Marcus's feet. The calls started on a Monday. His employer called first, HR, formally, to inform him that his license was under review and that he was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Then the local elder financial abuse nonprofit that our attorney had also contacted published a report, which is public record, which included documented cases from the previous 18 months in Cook County. Marcus's name appeared in that report, not as a convicted felon. Not yet. That process takes longer. But as a person of interest in an active civil case involving the financial exploitation of a parent. His name, in print, attached to those words. You understand what that means in a neighborhood like ours, in a church community, among people who have known his face since he was 7 years old, eating black-eyed peas straight from the pot with a spoon. The reputation that Marcus had been building his entire adult life, the successful businessman, the good son, the sharp young man with the champagne gold Lexus parked in front of his mother's cottage, began to unmake itself in real time. Colleagues called him, friends stopped calling. His professional network, which he had cultivated carefully and which represented the bulk of his business income, contracted sharply and then sharply again. You cannot be in financial services with elder exploitation documented in a county report. The industry has no tolerance for it. Whatever fortune he had been accumulating through his various schemes, legitimate and otherwise, became deeply complicated to access. His business wealth, built partly on stolen dollars, was now entangled in legal proceedings he could not easily exit. I want to be honest with you about something. I did not feel triumph. People expect triumph. They want you to say that when justice arrives, you feel vindicated, elevated, powerful. What I felt was something quieter and harder to name. I felt sorrow, actual grief, not for the loss of the son I thought I had, because I had already grieved that in November at the kitchen table, but for the son I had actually raised, the one who must have been somewhere inside the man who stood in the vestibule calculating his options, the boy who ate from the pot with a spoon. I grieved for what he could have been, and for the fact that he chose not to be it, And for all the years I spent making excuses to avoid seeing that choice clearly, that grief was real, and I let it be real. But I didn't let it move me. He called once, about 3 weeks after the report was published. He wanted to know if I would write a letter to his employer supporting his character. I listened to him ask this question. I heard the words, and then I felt something I wasn't expecting. Nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not the complicated maternal tug that had been pulling me toward him for 23 years. Just a quiet, clean absence, like a room that has been cleared out. No, I said. I won't do that. I hung up. I want you to feel what that felt like. That single syllable. The phone going silent. The January quiet of my cottage. The vegetable garden outside sleeping under frost. The handwritten recipe cards on the counter. The good vase with fresh tulips in it. Everything in its right place. Sister Dolores had asked me, in December, what I wanted my life to look like when this was over. Not the legal outcome, not the justice. What did I want for myself? What did I want to be doing in a year? I had sat with that question for a long time because I realized I hadn't asked myself what I wanted in so long that the question felt foreign, like a language I'd spoken as a child and let go unpracticed for decades. What I wanted, I finally told her, was to be useful in a way that belonged entirely to me. Not useful because I had been manipulated into it. Not useful because someone needed something from me. Useful because I had something real to offer. 26 years of nursing, 6 months of surviving elder financial exploitation, and a particular understanding of what it feels like to sit at a kitchen table in the early morning and realize that the story you've been living in is not the true story. I called the Senior Advocacy Center in February. They put me on the volunteer roster 3 days a week. I sit with women, mostly women, though not always, who are coming in from situations like mine, situations that range from subtle manipulation to outright theft, situations where the abuser is almost always family, almost always beloved, almost always someone whose love was real once, and then became conditional, and then became transactional, and finally became predatory. I sit with them, and I pour coffee, and I say, start with the math. I bring my handwritten recipe cards to the center sometimes, the recipe cards stained with years of cooking, with my mother's handwriting and her thumbprints. I let the women hold them. There is something about an object that has been held with love by many hands over many decades, something that communicates continuity, survival, the persistence of ordinary life through catastrophic circumstances. These cards have been in my family for 40 years. Nobody forged a signature to steal them. They're mine. I am saving money. This is a fact I want to say plainly. I am saving money. Accumulating it dollar by dollar in the account Marcus never knew about, the one I opened in my own name at a different bank. It will not be a fortune, not quickly, but it is growing. I have a goal. A small apartment by the ocean I always dreamed about. Somewhere the seagulls sound like possibility instead of grief. Somewhere winter means something different than frozen harbors and fogged windows. I have never wanted to leave Oak Park exactly, because Oak Park is mine, because this waterfront neighborhood and this cottage with peeling paint and a vegetable garden are the things I built my life inside of. But I want to know what it feels like to choose a new place entirely out of desire and not out of necessity. I want to do that while I am 58 years old and not a day older than I have to be. And when I finally drive away from Oak Park for the last time, I intend to be behind the wheel of a Lexus LS in champagne gold. His was a symbol of what my money built for him. Mine will be a symbol of what I built for myself after I stopped building for him. I have looked at the numbers, the savings, the legal settlement from the civil case, which, after the firm's investigation and the county report, Marcus settled rather than litigate, have made that dream closer than it has any right to be. The third time I held my recipe cards after all of this happened, I held them differently. The first time was comfort, standing in my kitchen on an ordinary morning, the smell of coffee, the habit of a lifetime. The second time was grief, pressed to my chest on a kitchen floor after the arithmetic had finished me. This third time was something I can only describe as recognition. I held my mother's handwriting, and I thought, she survived things I will never know the full shape of. She kept cooking. She kept writing these recipes down. She handed them to me, and she said, "This is how you do it. This is the thing that continues. The vegetable garden is still sleeping under frost. But I have already ordered the seeds for spring. It is March now. The harbor is still partially frozen but beginning to loosen. You can see the fishing boats rocking slightly again, responding to the water underneath the remaining ice. The seagulls in Oak Park sound different in March, still wild, still loud, but with something different in the cry, something forward-leaning. In January, they seem to be mourning. In March, they seem to be announcing. I stood at my kitchen sink this morning, watching the sun come up through the window, and the fog on the glass from the warmth inside felt different than it did in January. In January, the fog felt like concealment, like the warmth of the cottage was something I was hiding from the cold. This morning, it felt like proof that something living is inside this house, something warm enough to create its own weather. I am 58 years old. My cross necklace is warm against my collarbone. My cherry red housecoat is on. The black-eyed peas are cooking on the back burner. My handwritten recipe cards are on the counter, and on top of them, the good vase, with fresh tulips, yellow. Unreasonable in early March, but I have decided that unreasonable beauty is one of my rights. The civil case settled in February. Marcus paid back $89 of the $147,000 in documented transfers, which was what the attorneys determined was recoverable given the current state of his finances. His business income, already diminished by the investigation, had collapsed further after the county report and the professional license review. He is not in prison. I want to be clear about that. Civil fraud, financial exploitation, forgery, these things can result in criminal charges, and our attorney told me that the county DA's office was reviewing the case. But the machinery of criminal justice moves slowly, and I made peace with the possibility that there might not be a courtroom ending. What there was public. What there was real. His reputation in the financial services community, the professional identity he had spent 10 years building, is effectively destroyed. The business wealth he had accumulated is entangled in legal proceedings he may spend years trying to exit. I find that I don't spend much time thinking about his losses. That surprised me. I thought justice would feel like watching him suffer, and instead it feels like not caring whether he suffers or not. Complete indifference to his trajectory. What I care about is the trajectory of the women at the Senior Advocacy Center. What I care about is the tulips in the good vase. What I care about is the ocean apartment I am saving toward, 1 week at a time, with money that belongs entirely and irrevocably to me. I volunteer 3 days a week now. I have sat with 43 women since February. 43 women at different stages of understanding what has been done to them, what has been taken, how long they have been living inside a story that someone else wrote for them. What I tell them, every single time, is this. Start with the math. Not because money is the point. Money is almost never the point. But because the math doesn't gaslight you. The math doesn't tell you that you're confused or ungrateful or unwell. The math is just the math, and when you sit with it long enough, it begins to tell you the truth. I need to say some things directly now because this story is bigger than mine, and I think you know it. What happened to me has a name, elder financial exploitation. And it is not rare. I need you to understand how not rare it is. A 2012 study revealed that 1 in 4 nursing home residents suffered physical abuse, and financial exploitation runs deeper and quieter than physical abuse because it leaves no visible marks, because it exploits love and trust and the particular vulnerability of people who have spent their lives building for others. Research reveals that only 1 in 24 cases of elder abuse is ever reported. because the abusers are almost always family, and silence feels like loyalty until it costs you your house and your heart attack goes unanswered. 1 in 24. Think about that. Think about how many women there are right now, sitting in their kitchens in the early morning doing math that doesn't add up, telling themselves they must be confused, telling themselves that a good mother trusts her son. What happened to me is also intergenerational trauma. I have to name that because it is part of the education I owe the people listening to this. My grandchildren watched their father treat their grandmother like a financial instrument. They are absorbing that lesson the way children absorb all lessons, not through what they're told, but through what they observe. They are learning what family means, what love looks like, what it means to be a woman in this family, from the example their father provided. That is not a small thing. The harm that gets done in one generation seeds the soil for the harm that grows in the next. I am fighting to give them a different lesson, one quilt square at a time. I am showing them, by example, that a woman who has been used does not have to stay used. That recovery is real. That love worth having does not cost you your identity. If you are in something like what I described, if you are doing math that doesn't add up, if someone in your family is managing your finances and you don't fully understand the structures, if you are talking yourself out of your own instincts because you don't want to believe what the evidence is showing you, please, start with the math, then call an attorney, then call a Sister Dolores. You do not have to handle this alone, and you do not have to handle it in silence to prove that you are loyal. Loyalty is not silence. Loyalty is not martyrdom. Loyalty is not handing someone your entire net worth and asking nothing in return. What I had with Marcus was not loyalty. What I had was fear. Fear of being the kind of mother who didn't trust her son. Fear of being the kind of woman who caused problems. Fear of being alone in this cottage with the truth. I traded 23 years of myself to avoid that fear. The fear was smaller than I thought. The truth was survivable. Every Sunday morning now, I stop at the corner market and buy myself flowers with my own money. Tulips usually, because they are bright and they are mine. I bring them home. I put them in the good vase. I stand at the kitchen sink and watch the sun come up through the fogged window, and the woman looking back at me in the glass is someone I haven't seen in a long time. She is 58 years old, and she is wearing a cherry red housecoat, and her hands are steady, and she knows exactly who she is. She is a licensed practical nurse. She is a quilter. She is a woman who reads every document before she signs it and questions every dosage and argues with senior physicians when they are wrong. She is a woman who stood in a church vestibule in January and said enough out loud, to the person who needed to hear it most. She is a woman who is going to drive a champagne gold Lexus to an apartment by the ocean, and when she gets there, she is going to stand at a new window and watch the sun come up over a different water, and the seagulls will sound like possibility, and she will have flowers in a vase, and she will be, at last, entirely herself. I want to ask you something before I go. Where are you listening to this? Are you in your kitchen? In the early morning? Maybe with your own coffee going and the radio low? Are you in a car, on a commute, watching the outside world scroll past the window? Wherever you are, I want to know. And here's what I really want to know. What would you have done? At what point in this story would you have made a different choice? When would you have finally said enough? Tell me in the comments. I read them, not because I need validation, I'm past that, but because your answer tells me something about where you are in your own story, and I am, at heart, still a woman who sits with other women and listens. If this story reached something inside you, if it said something you needed to hear or put words to something you couldn't quite name, press like. It takes 2 seconds, and it means this story finds the people who need it. And subscribe if you want more. Not because the numbers matter to me in some abstract way, but because every story I tell is a woman who said enough, and there are more of those women than any statistic can count, and they deserve to be heard. I'll be back next week. Until then, start with the math. And buy yourself some flowers. You've earned them.